Hello and welcome to this HIA webinar about the JobKeeper payment and the residential building industry. Today we will talk about what the JobKeeper payment is and whether or not you are eligible. Also, HIA has developed a series of fact sheets and webinars to assist members understand these new requirements. The process can be complex, and if members are requiring assistance, please contact HIA Workplace Services on the number on the screen or by the email address. So what is the JobKeeper payment? Well, there are two aspects once you have been determined to be eligible. Firstly, as an employer, you will be eligible for a wage subsidy of $1,500 before tax per fortnight per employee for up to 6 months. PAYG is payable on this amount. The payment of superannuation, however, will depend on whether the employee's usual wages are more or less than the $1,500 wage subsidy. For more information, see the HIA info sheet number 4, receiving the payment. The second aspect of the JobKeeper payment is that once you are eligible, an employer can give eligible employees directions in relation to hours of work and annual leave. These working arrangement directions are further explained in another HIA information sheet available on our website. It is important to remember that the purpose of the JobKeeper payment is to support employers maintain a connection with their employees, enabling businesses to reactivate their operations quickly without having to rehire staff when the COVID-19 crisis is over. So who is eligible? Employers and business owners can be eligible. Now, in relation to business owners, you can receive the JobKeeper payment directly. A business owner is not required to have employees to be eligible. Once either you as the employer or business owner are eligible, employees must also satisfy a range of criteria to become eligible for the JobKeeper payment. Next, I will go through in detail the eligibility criteria for employers, business owners, and employees. Employers are eligible if you have a turnover of less than $1 billion and your turnover has or will be reduced by more than 30% relative to the comparable period a year ago. That period must be of at least a month, but can be up to a quarter. For example, you will be immediately eligible if your March 2020 turnover has reduced by 30% when compared to your March 2019 turnover. Or you will become eligible in June 2020 if your turnover has reduced by 30% when compared to your June 2019 turnover. Employers with a turnover of more than $1 billion are also eligible if their turnover will be reduced by more than 50% relative to a comparable period a year ago. Moving on to when an employee will be eligible. So once a business is eligible, your employees will only be eligible if they satisfy the following criteria. They must be currently employed, and that includes those who you might have stood down or rehired. The employee must have been employed at 1 March 2020. The employee must be full-time, part-time, or a long-term casual. A long-term casual is someone who has been employed on a regular basis for longer than 12 months, as at 1 March. The employee has to be at least 16 years old, be an Australian citizen and hold a particular visa class, were a resident for Australian tax purposes on 1 March and are not in receipt of a JobKeeper payment from another employer. Moving on to when a business owner will be eligible. Business owners will be eligible if they estimate their turnover has or will fall by 30% or more, if they had an ABN on or before 12 March 2020, and either had an amount included in its assessable income for the 2018-19 year, and it was included in the income tax return lodged on or before the 12th of March, or made a supply during the period of 1 July 2018 to 12 March 2020 and provided this information to the tax office on or before the 12th of March. Business owners must also be actively engaged in the operations and activities of the business. They must have a particular role within the business. So, for example, if you are a sole trader, the individual must be the entity. For partnerships, the individual must be a partner in the partnership. For a trust, the individual must be an adult beneficiary of the trust. And for a company, the individual must either be a director or a shareholder in the company. Business owners will only be eligible if they are not entitled to another JobKeeper payment, are not a permanent employee of another employer, were at least 16 years of age at 1 March, and are an Australian citizen or hold a permanent visa or other specific class of visa category. As I mentioned briefly, other business structures that are eligible include partnerships, trusts, some company directors and some shareholders. So in a partnership, only one partner can be nominated as receiving the JobKeeper payment. In relation to trusts, a trust can receive the JobKeeper payment for any eligible employees. Where beneficiaries of a trust only receive distributions rather than being paid salary and wages for work done, only one individual adult beneficiary can be nominated to receive the payment. In relation to company directors, a company director who receives director's fees can be eligible for the payment, but only one director can be nominated. And in relation to shareholders, where that shareholder is paid for the provision of labour, only one shareholder is entitled to receive the JobKeeper payment. Moving on to how you, as an employer or a business owner, satisfy the decline in turnover test. So your business will be eligible for the JobKeeper payment if you can demonstrate a 30% decline or a projected 30% decline in turnover. A business will need to nominate either a relevant month or quarter in 2020 and compare that to the same period in 2019 in order to show that the business has experienced or is likely to experience the relevant fall in turnover. The tax rules relating to the scheme specify the relevant month or quarter for comparison purposes. So, for example, you must compare the March 2020 month with the March 2019 month. You could not compare the March 2020 month with the April 2019 month. The same applies if you wish to use the quarter starting on 1 April 2020. You must use the quarter starting 1 April 2019 as a comparator. If you were not in business a year earlier, or your turnover a year earlier is not representative of your usual or average turnover, the ATO will have discretion to consider additional information that the business can provide to establish that you have been adversely affected by the impacts of coronavirus. For example, because you were scaling up your business or your turnover is typically highly variable. Now turning to turnover, which is calculated as it is for GST purposes and as it would be reported on a business activity statement. This includes all taxable supplies and all GST-free supplies, but not input taxed supplies. The definitions of the terms projected turnover and current turnover are those set out in the GST Act. However, some changes have been made so that the calculation of turnover is confined to the relevant period, being either the month or the quarter that's nominated, and is calculated at the end of that period. The explanatory materials note that projected GST turnover includes the value of all the supplies that an entity has made or is likely to make in the period. A supply is likely to be made where, on the balance of probabilities, it can be predicted that the supply is more likely than not to be made. The likelihood of a supply being made must be based on a reasonable expectation and considered in the context of the facts and circumstances of a particular business, such as by reference to the terms of a particular contract which requires supplies to be made in a certain period. It is also important to note that you only need to satisfy the turnover test once. Once you've satisfied that test, you are eligible for the JobKeeper payment for the entire period to the end of September, when the payments cease. Your accountant may be able to help you determine your eligibility. Here is just a quick example of how you might qualify for the JobKeeper payment. So Bob is a builder and he applies for the JobKeeper scheme during the first fortnight the scheme starts operating, which is the fortnight ending the 12th of April 2020. The turnover test period for Bob can either be the month of March 2020 or April 2020, or the quarter from April 2020 to the end of June 2020. The comparison period is the corresponding period in 2019. Using these periods allows the Commissioner to examine changes in GST turnover that is reported. So finally, what's next? What do I need to do now, or what should you do now to ensure that you receive the JobKeeper payment? So the first step is to determine if your business is eligible in either the March or April month or the quarter of April. If you determine that you have experienced a 30% decline in turnover, you should enrol with the ATO, and you can click that link on the slide there, so you'll receive further details on how to apply and how the scheme will work. You also need to then download the JobKeeper employee nomination notice and provide this to your employees to complete. This is to not only advise your employees that they are part of the scheme, but is also a record that you need to keep as the business or the employer of those employees who you need to pass on the $1,500 wage subsidy to. From the 20th of April, an eligible employer can then enrol in the scheme using the ATO business portal and your MyGov ID. And then finally, by the end of April, you need to collect all of the completed JobKeeper employee nomination notices. And then from the 4th of May, you will be able to confirm the identity of those eligible employees with the ATO. Of note, the first payments will be made from the 14th of May and will cover the first two, what they call JobKeeper fortnights, which commenced from the 30th of March. If you have any further questions or queries, go to the HIA website and click through the COVID-19 landing page. HIA has a series of information sheets on the JobKeeper payment, or as I mentioned at the outset, contact Workplace Services on 1300 650 620 or send an email at inquiry@hia.com.au. Thank you for your time.